I'm Michael Palmyre, the Consumer Experience Lead at the Data Standards body. And so what I'm going to just be doing now is going through the Consumer Experience Standards and also touching on the Consumer Experience Guidelines, noting that there is a distinction between the two. But in this section here, there's, as you can see down the side, just as James discussed, there are various elements within the Consumer Experience Standards that we've chunked up accordingly. And what you can see, I guess, first is probably the most pertinent to at least the energy stakeholders on this call today. And that's because data language standards are obviously sector specific. So what we currently have here in the data language standards relates to banking sector data as opposed to energy sector data. So obviously that's going to be expanded on to accommodate the energy sector and to describe the energy sector data sets as well. But what the data language standards actually seek to do is present data sets to consumers in a way that is comprehensible. So what you can see, there's terminology used here, data clusters and permission language effectively here. So on the right, we actually have a visual. This is what a consumer would see, for example, when an ADO is requesting transaction details from them. They're asking that consumer to share their transaction details. So at the top here, we've got transaction details, and underneath we have something that is called permission. So it's the additional information or additional description of the information that would be shared as part of transaction details. So these standards apply to data recipients and data holders whenever they're presenting that data to a consumer. So the consent flow, authorization flow, dashboards, and so on. It's chunked up, I won't go into detail here, into various sections based on the data sets. But as an example to kind of talk through, and James will probably touch on this next, it maps to the authorization scopes. So we have, for example, this is the data cluster language that a consumer would see. These as the permissions that if they wanted to dial into the detail, they could see in addition to this data cluster language, and it's reflecting the data that would actually be shared as part of this authorization scope. So that's a kind of detail there of how that would work. And obviously we've got a decision proposal being developed at the moment relating to AMO held and retailer held data that we did work on workshop last year as well. And we're not expecting to change too significantly from that point. But obviously this will be expanded on to reflect those energy related data sets as well. Moving down this list here to accessibility standards, that's another element. Obviously, the consumer experience standards relate a lot to what a consumer actually interacts with and how they interact with the CDR, which is a kind of a level above or a kind of lower level of detail, perhaps, to what the rules and technical standards do at times as well. So what this kind of refers to here, to aid things like comprehension, accessibility, and so on, it refers to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, so we're CAG. And this is a statement for CDR participants to seek to comply with these. And there is flexibility in that, noting that obviously in some contexts it doesn't make sense or it isn't possible to comply with these like non-digital formats and so on. Moving on to the next section, this is broken up very much in terms of the consent model itself. So consent, authentication, authorization, and management, so dashboards, is how these sections are effectively broken up. I won't go through these in detail here, but these relate to consent, authentication, and authorization. But I will just stop in the authorization section for a moment because this is a useful one to kind of touch on now. But the rules, for example, do not allow additional elements to be introduced to the authorization flow by data holders unless supported by the rules or standards. So what we have here are obviously some things relating to account selection, profile selection, and so on. But you will note that in some of these, we have some softer language. So the nomenclature, that we use is obviously aligned to the technical standards, must, should, may, and so on. But there are a lot of shoulds and mays down here. So it's worth noting there that what we're actually doing is creating additional flexibility within the authorization flow, not requiring data holders to implement these certain items, but allowing them to, if they need to cater to certain scenarios. So that's additional utility of the CX standards in this context, is to actually increase what could be added to the authorization flow if required to tend to a certain scenario. And that's what these elements here seek to do in relation to unavailable accounts. And that obviously relates to the energy sector particularly with things like secondary users, for example, given the provenance that might have. I'll skip over the amending authorization standards. That's a kind of probably a 102 session as opposed to 101 to just go over the basics, but I'll finish here on the standards section with the withdrawal standards. So the withdrawal standards apply to both data recipients and data holders depending on the standard. They are specified here, whether it's data holder or data recipient. But what these standards effectively relate to are where a consumer may be withdrawing something like a consent or an authorization or a permission, like a secondary user instruction. And these are effectively done, most likely on a dashboard. And these standards just relate to what ought to be communicated to a consumer as part of that withdrawal process. So that's, the end of the CX standards section, but I'll just jump back to the top here because there is another element here. Obviously, the CX standards are required, they're mandatory. There's obviously optionality within those standards depending on the language, but we also have CX guidelines, which are an important element of what we'll do. So I'll just jump to that for a moment. This takes you, straight from this link to the website, our website, consumerdatastandards.gov.au. You can get to this section by going to guidelines and conventions and then CX guidelines. And what this page here shows is actually just an archive list of past CX guidelines that we had. And this is the one that I'm wanting to point you to now, which is a new platform that we've been using since December to host our CX guidelines. So this is where you can find our CX guidelines. And CX guidelines, as this disclaimer at the bottom notes, they provide optional examples of key requirements and recommendations. So key aspects of the rules, technical standards, CX standards, obviously incomplete, and recommendations from the research that we've been conducting and other literature that we've been reviewing, going all the way back to 2018 as well. Obviously, these are examples of how to implement those key items. So it's not a complete list. There are elements that would need to be tended to separately. And obviously the obligation to comply is on the CDR participant. So this isn't necessarily, a certificate. It's an example of how you might implement, though the rules do note that CDR participants should have regard to the CX guidelines. So they are a benchmark and reference point, if you will. So there are some, key elements in the CX guidelines. I'll jump into the actual CX guideline in a moment, but I do want to briefly touch on some other artifacts that we hold in here. So a few things that are worth reading through here, metrics that we've used to assess things like informed consent and comprehension and so on. But I will jump into this one here because this might be useful for the people on the call today, and that's the CX checklist. And we've developed this based on community requests. And it is effectively, it's worth jumping to this bit here, the read first, but I won't go into that detail. It's a complete list of items that we reference in the CX guidelines. So not a complete list of everything, but what we reference in the CX guidelines. So what we actually have here is a very long list of things because we reference a lot of rules, technical standards, CX standards, guidelines, and so on, privacy safeguards in our CX guidelines. And what you can see here in this list, there's kind of unique references. There's some key columns here that are probably going to be of most interest around what type it is, whether it's a CX standard or a rule or a guideline, who it applies to, a data holder or a data recipient, maybe both, the obligation level, whether it's a must or a should or a may, the statement itself, and then a link here to where you can actually find a guideline for this element and when it was introduced as well, which is the whatever version of the standards it was when this element was introduced or released, and the date as well that it was introduced to help tracking there. So that's useful, it's downloadable, but has been used and requested by particularly compliance people and designers, obviously, because it is helpful as a starting point to understand where those elements surface to the consumer in the consent model, for example. Again, really emphasizing that it isn't a complete list, but I think maybe the only one that kind of goes to it in this level of detail across different obligations as well. I'll jump back now to just give you one example of an actual guideline or a guideline page that we have. So these guidelines are broken up into aspects of the consent model, just like the standards where it goes consent, authenticate, authorize, and consent management, which is dashboards for data holders and data recipients there. So what I'll do here is jump straight into authorize, noting that there are probably a lot of prospective data holders on the call, retailers in the energy sector. And I'll jump to this section here, which is authorize, and just quickly walk through one example. And what we have in these pages is a high-level overview of what authorize refers to, where it sits in that consent model process, and some key elements here, and also potentially variations. So like I showed in the standards page, there's kind of the straightforward consent flow where you have authorization, and there's perhaps the CDR 102, which is amending authorizations and some additional elements as well that kind of go beyond initial consent being established. So I'll jump here to the authorization to disclose, which is effectively the process of the data holder after receiving a request from an ADR to seek consumers' authorization to disclose that data to an ADR, to the ADR requesting that data. So in this example here, authorization to disclose, similar structure. We've got a few elements here, but this is the stuff here. So we have a default example. We use Figma heavily to show what this would look like in practice to a consumer, potentially, noting that they're optional examples. These are all able to be interacted with. I won't do it now because I'm scared of what will happen if I'm doing this while screen sharing, but you can maximize the screen to make it full screen as well. And what these are wireframes, illustrating what it could look like to implement key rules, standards, and recommendations, and so on. These are annotated, color-coded as well. So you can see, if I jump down to this one, for example, underneath here, we have a guideline table of key requirements and guidelines. So if you look to number 5 here, and you go to number 5, that's a rules reference here. If you go down to one of these blue ones, say number 18, you jump down further, and that's what you can see here as a guideline reference. So these are all here. We have another way of kind of accessing this, but if you jump down to here, we also provide a prototype example of this, so you can kind of see it in practice here. So this is, quite literally just the authorization flow of the basic example there, and it shows those elements there, prototype, so you can see how they are linked together for the authorization flow. We do have these different elements here, variations and so on, and you can see here, if you just kind of open it up, it's the same thing, has guidelines, wireframes that are annotated, and tables there that you can look to as examples. And moving down the bottom here, and I'll kind of wrap up here, we have open source assets for each of these guidelines too. So here you can see download open source asset, and we have all of these elements available here in a downloadable Figma file. So these are version controlled. You can see that this open source asset was created to align with version 1.11.0, and here is the date as well. And these Figma files contain everything that you can see on this page. They contain these wireframes here in those as well, and they have effectively a table that is the equivalent of this table down here in that design file, so you can map accordingly and have everything you need there. And these are typically also linked up as a prototype, so you can open up that prototype view in Figma to see how they work there too. These are all based on the Australian Government Design System website, so they have been reviewed for accessibility compliance as well internally. So you can be confident that from our perspective, we've reviewed them based on how to correctly implement the CX standards, and there are other elements in there as well that would be useful to consider. So it is not necessarily something to directly implement. Obviously, there's brand and tone changes that need to occur, but it is a starting point to kind of reduce barriers to implementing quickly. So for those on the call, especially in the energy sector, it might be of interest for compliance people and designers and so on. So take a look at these, play with them to understand how these work, to have useful reference points for your own implementations there too.